Welcome to an Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, Peter. How was that?
That was really good.
You do the long hello.
It's true. I'm just excited to see you. There's anticipation before you come on because it says connecting to audio. So I'm just so excited.
That's good stuff.
Yeah. Daniel Sobel is our guest this week.
I know Daniel Sobel is our guest this week. It was kind of exciting that Daniel Sobel was our guest this week. So actually, this happens every once in a while. Like we have a bunch, the benefit of the podcast is that it is predominantly educators from around the nation that people don't know. These are just people doing the job. But Daniel Sobel has a name.
Yeah. And I must admit, he's internationally known in terms of the work that he does to guide entire nations. I talked to him last week, just in a conversation, and he's guiding the entire country of Iraq. Its work around gifted and talented, and with a real effort in terms of keeping its gifted and talented students either connected to their home in terms of their country. And so I didn't really know him. And so in our conversation, I just talked to him. I think that we should do with anybody who's that big in any field. They're just people. So just talk to them.
Exactly. And it turns out he also thinks of himself as just a person.
I love what he's just like. I just wear sweatpants.
I wear shorts and t-shirts.
Wear a t-shirt right now. Yeah.
Shorts and t-shirts every day. And I'm like, oh, I can relate.
Yeah. He's the Adam Sandler of inclusion education.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I found it. I really loved it. And I wondered, I have a good question, but I wonder whether it should go at the front end or the back end. I mean, as both that I started in special ed and then later on I had children and now have a child with special needs of my own. And the being on both sides of the process, being both an educator in special education as well as a parent in special education, I am profoundly changed in terms of how I think about inclusion and how I advocate. To his point, what did he call himself? A pestering dad? No.
Something like that.
Yeah. But that's who I am. And I actually really love my son's teachers. But I care very deeply about the way in which they think about it and interrupt them when they don't.
That's interesting because when we first met, and I think one of the first conversations we had, whether it was part of the podcast or just getting to know each other, you were describing the process of advocating for a diagnosis and B, I think probably more appropriate for the second part after our audience has listened to the conversation.
Let's put it there. Honestly, he is very well connected. You even say at some point during the interview, that's kind of all the countries, just saying.
It's almost all of them. No. We're in 140 or something, 120,
138. 138.
I think that's most of them.
It's most of them. It's
really fun. And he's just totally down to earth. So Daniel Sobel is our guest. He is the founder of the International Forum of Inclusion Practitioners. And he's also, in the next month or so, hosting the upcoming inaugural World Inclusion Congress in Kazakhstan, for which I was invited to be a participant. I'm unable to go this time. But next year, it's in Qatar, or Qatar. And so that's pretty exciting. So something to think about. For our guests who might be interested, anyone interested in going to Kazakhstan? And I don't say that flippantly. I think it could be an amazing opportunity. So anyhow, let's get into our conversation. You are listening to an Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I am Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Almanzan.
We'll see you on the other side.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zach Taylor. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Transforming Education.
And I'm Peter Stiepelman, a former superintendent from the Midwest and the host of an Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. And listen, we call it an imperfect leader because one of the things that we do know in leadership is that we get into these positions and then there's sort of this expectation that we're going to be perfect. And that's just not the case. And what we're seeking all the time is an opportunity to come together with others who are doing very similar work and learn from each other, share our stories, share our successes, and also try to figure out how to solve some of our problems. And so Zach and I have created Talk Soup is what we're affectionately calling it, SUPT, right? In terms of superintendents, coming together, learning together, and also having fun together. Zach, what else would you add?
I just say that in my work with school leaders that I've seen almost, a kind of loneliness at the top of the system. And the fact that oftentimes leaders feel lonely, it's a lonely place. And this is an opportunity to come, to even commiserate a little bit, but also to have a reflective practice, to find solutions and to come together with people who understand, maybe the only people that really understand what you're going through, and to find those solutions, to find ways to feel encouraged, to move forward day to day, month to month as we meet.
If you'd like to learn more, come over to our website, imperfectleader.com, and sign up. We'd love to spend time with you.
We look forward to seeing you.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, we welcome Daniel Sobel, an internationally respected voice in inclusion education and founder and chair of the International Forum of Inclusion Practitioners. Daniel champions student participation and belonging while tackling systemic issues like teacher training. He's the founder and president of the first ever World Inclusion Congress, sharing global strategies to advance inclusion. His insights are essential for system leaders committed to supporting all children. Daniel, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here.
It is so good to see you again. And listen, I've been looking forward to this conversation, also dreading this conversation. And I'll admit that's a strange way of welcoming someone to a podcast. Hey, glad you're here. I'm dreading our conversation. But the reason for that, the trepidation comes from when I was superintendent. I had a conversation with a parent, and it haunts me to this day. I think about it all the time. She wanted her child with special needs, an exceptional child, to attend classes with her peers. And the programming her child was receiving, it was what was considered the least restrictive environment, but it was not with her peers. And without getting too far into it, I can remember the parent repeating to me that what my district said about me, that I was a parent of 3 witty children endlessly endeavoring to outsmart their parents. And she looked at me and said, how could you possibly understand what I'm asking for? You'll never understand. And in everything I've read about you, Daniel, your perspective emphasizes that the goal for every child is maximizing a child's participation, their engagement, and a sense of belonging within the classroom. And removing children for interventions can undermine this. So that was a long way of asking this question. So my apologies, but for those who are watching, Daniel did continue to stick with me. So I appreciate it. How can district leadership, how can they encourage that shift of thinking across their schools, prioritizing support models that build student confidence and independence within the general education setting over those that rely heavily on pulling students out, even when they're using evidence-based practices?
It's a really significant and complex question, which actually stretches many different countries there is actually a policy aspiration in all of to be fully inclusive as a top agenda item in all of the countries that we deal with. Is about 138 countries. And that in itself is significant to point out, meaning that it was no longer a sort of sidebar issue or something that is a bolt-on issue or something that we need to think of after the fact, but rather it has become a top priority issue up there with AI. Those two issues are pretty much the top sort of global education issues. So in some ways, inclusion has been very successful. It's kind of crept its way up the ladder from slowly but surely from the 1970s in sort of quirky, eccentric ways, and has gone via calling children different labels and legalistic demands and confrontations between parents and funding bodies and schools, and it's complicated. It feels to me that evolution journey is only halfway there. We're not quite there yet. And there is a number of sticking points which recur in most education settings, which is that inclusion in general, and by inclusion, every country has its own definitions of what it means. But broadly, I'm interested in the broadest sense, as long as it doesn't touch into the sort of the political, so that the big sort of mountains of concern are the amount of time that it can sap from teachers who are already overwhelmed, the amount of money that it can take from the very limited pot of money that school leaders already have to play with, and also the stress levels that dealing with certain complex issues and complex cases can deal with. Confrontations with parents, for example. And there, of course, in America and in England, to some extent Australia, but less so in other countries, there is a sort of litigious, legalistic element to it as well. So all of those mountains are significant. There are very few things that you can do to foul swoop, just try and sort out all of those in one simple answer. But I think there are a handful which are worth thinking about. Number one is upskilling teachers. So in my understanding of how schools work and in the 100 papers that I've published, and my team and I have worked with about 10,000 schools. It seems like the number one thing above and beyond all others is upskilling teachers to be able to meet the needs of all children in the classroom. Now, there's a slightly controversial issue here because you have teachers who are supposedly already qualified teachers, right? And now how are we going to upskill them? How are we going to do that? When have we got time to do that? Who's got the money to do that? And how dare you ask them to learn more things? They're already professional teachers, and this is the way we've always done things. And so actually, it's not as easy as it sounds. And we've got a global inclusive teaching initiative, which is in about 80 different countries at the moment. And we've had to overcome quite a lot of these kind of questions and these sorts of barriers. But upskilling teachers will solve 95% of all issues. So well, think about this for a minute. You could spend a lot of money on a child's education, with interventions and with additional support, staffing, etc. Or you can spend 5% of that amount of money upskilling the teacher and supporting the teacher, and you would have a 95% efficacy rate. Now, that is a significantly different way of thinking about things. I personally feel quite strongly that the educational training programs in universities and colleges are not preparing teachers well enough.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, I took one class, right? Somebody came in and said, let me tell you about special education. Here's what IDEA means in the United States in terms of federal protections for children. Here's what an IEP might look like. And you're going to have children who have significant needs. And don't worry, they'll get the sort of goals and program that they'll need. There was no sort of, I mean, you're talking about upskilling. There was very little skilling in terms of just even being prepared. We were being prepared to be general practitioners. And and I don't think you're suggesting, I'm putting in using as a medical model, we were general practitioners, and you're not suggesting that we all become cardiologists now. What you are, I think, suggesting is there are some skills and learning that you can receive to be able to be better supportive of children who have specific goals that may not require being pulled out to go to a specialist. Is that fair?
That is such a good way of putting it. I used to use the engineering model, even though I know nothing about engineering. But I was like, if you've trained as a chemical engineer and then somebody says, build this bridge, and you're like,
But you're an engineer. Yeah.
And I don't think any other profession would tolerate this. And in some ways, I'm a strong advocate. I mean, I'm a very strong advocate for the well-being of teachers, and that I think as long as inclusion represents teachers having to do yet more, then it simply won't.
Right. And so many teachers, as today, it's never been harder to be a teacher. And that one of the first things you hear is, I don't know what to do. What do you want me to do? I've already have 30, 40 other pupils in my classroom. And now you want me to do this? And I mean, there are models that can support where a special education teacher or a coach who enters the classroom and they co-teach. And the teacher learns, and then there's maybe a gradual release of responsibility as opposed to always being there to be, oh, I don't work with you. That person works. No, we're going to do this together. And then I'll pull away and go work with somebody else as now you've got the skills you need. That's sort of real time, just in time professional learning.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different, I mean, the Global Inclusive Teaching Initiative, which I mentioned, the book which I produced about the inclusive classroom. These are simple methods. Some people prefer a book. Some people prefer in-person work. Some people are training, but the way that you described it as being, we were all general practitioners, and why do you need me to be a cardiologist or a surgeon now? Whereas actually what we need to do is slightly, and it is slightly, readjust what being a general practitioner really looks like. And it cannot be that we're asking a general practitioner to do yet more. It just has to be not quite this, it's more like that. And therein lies the solution to pretty much all inclusion stuff. And as it's just acknowledging, it's not quite as simple as all of that, and it quite requires some sort of planning, sophistication. One of the biggest issues, for example, not just in, I'm sure this is true all over the world, and you can tell me more about America because I don't know so much about the States. There's a concept a phrase that I've invented called initiative-itis, where you ask teachers to do something, or you want to do another initiative in a school, and the lift of the eyes and, oh, here we go again, yet another thing to do.
Yes, we often refer to it as initiative fatigue, although I do initiative-itis so if you coined it, we'll make sure that it's trademarked here, or at least make sure everyone knows that. But that's true, right? I mean, it's, you want me to do what? And now you know what? I'll just wait for you to leave because you're only going to be the leader here for a little bit. And then I'll wait for the next person to come before I try something new.
Getting back to your question, which is a brilliant one, it really captures a lot of the issue, a lot of the problem about this parents. So we have a parent who has a certain, let's say, demand. I mean, this is another thing, is that in many countries, the hardest issue for senior leaders to deal with is the confrontation with angry, demanding parents. Now, I'm a sort of angry, demanding parent myself. But I mean, I can really relate to it. I've had it. I've been on the front line for years with that. As far as I'm aware, there is hardly any training available for teachers or for senior leaders in how to manage those sorts of conversations. And understandably, parents who have children who have additional needs have spent their entire life trying to campaign and having to argue and having to push. And of course, you have sometimes the exact opposite, parents who just simply themselves have their own different types of needs, mental health issues. And this is all in the mix. And somehow they're not quite pushing enough as a parent that you bear witness to. But as school leaders, we don't have the training for that. I put a chapter in one of my books about it. I'm not plugging it, but one of the things I found when I wrote that chapter was there's hardly any references. There's hardly any meaningful training programs out there. I mean, I'm sure there are, by the way, in America, possibly, lots of opportunities for different sort of things. But this is a major issue. And we cannot ignore these two massive topics of initiative-itis, or initiative fatigue, as you describe it, and dealing with parents. Just to deal with inclusion in isolation is actually where a lot of the problems have emerged from, because they're not really considering what implementation looks like, what the realities look like. So this is the other second piece, which I would say, apart from upskilling teachers, is about really considering the realities of implementation.
I wish I had your book when I had that meeting with a parent. I was responsible for 19,000 children. And so by the time it gets to my level, this is a parent, as you just described, is probably exhausted of having to advocate and fight for what she really believed was going to be the right path for her child. And I was basically the last step, and I was somewhat speechless. Yes, what she said was, I mean, I don't think she intended to hurt me or to insult me. I think what she was trying to do, if I could sift through and look for a golden nugget there, was that she was trying to say, I'm exhausted. I want the best for my child. And I feel like all I'm doing is banging my head against a system that is not listening. And I wish I had your book to maybe have had the words to say, it sounds like we really need to take a step back, and what is it that you want for your child? What is it that we're trying to, what is the world you're trying to create for your child?
I think that inherent to this topic is also something which is actually psychologically quite painful, and which is that we are having to confront and deal with failure quite a lot, our own personal individual failures to include a child in a particular way, the parents' accusations of failure, and of course they're deferring and reflecting on their own personal failures, and so on and so forth. This is a vulnerable topic, and it's inappropriate to wade in to this topic without having a full appreciation of the breadth of human experience that goes into this, which is why I think I'm really particularly interested in relocating the conversation of inclusion to not just about the child, but actually about the adults around the child. Because actually what's going on for the adults around the child is going to influence the child possibly even more so.
Yeah, I love that. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this dimension, the leaders learning work, and inside is this dimension, there's this term, harvesting the collective wisdom, and it's the involvement and honoring of many voices. So appropriate to, as a continued thread of what you just said. And I bring this up because you're involved, obviously, in the International Forum of Inclusion Practitioners as a founder, and you advise systems and entire governments. The fact 138 countries, you just sort of just said. And I think, I mean, when you think about the UN and the number of countries, I'm like, that's almost all of them. You are preparing for an upcoming World Inclusion Congress, and you're going to be working with international bodies like UNESCO and the G20. And I really, could you share the vision for the World Inclusion Congress, discuss how connecting with global perspectives and research through initiatives like your own primary organization, IFIP, that they can provide valuable insights, strategies for district leaders, and really advance this work that you've just talked about in terms of inclusive education within their own systems.
Thank you for asking me about it.
I'm excited.
It's my big topic at the moment. There's something which we've been trying to help governments. UNESCO, I did a big event for UNESCO last year in Paris at the Global Inclusive Schools Forum. We invited school practitioners to meet with ministers of education, ministries of education, and give advice and support around, and to discuss together around what inclusion really needs to look like. We did a similar thing for the G20, and I was really pleased to say when we presented the paper in Brazil that our research paper, which is based on practitioners from all over, school leaders, and parents. They were that the G20 basically plagiarized our document, which I'm delighted with. And that's really what we wanted. We wanted to have that sort of influence. So that was really fantastic. The idea of the World Congress then is to actually set our own agenda, that we take the agenda of inclusion into our own hands and not just be waiting to see where policy shifts are and what governments are doing. So this is the rise of the practitioner voice, right? The rise of the revenge of the practitioners. So no, we have, well, the joke obviously, but we have.
Got it. Yeah.
So what I've done is
the practitioner strikes back. We got all the Star Wars references. We'll just keep going.
But it's quite interesting actually, because in most countries, vast majority, they're not very good at listening to practitioners, and the Ministry of Education will end up doing something, and most of the teachers are thinking, "What?" And what we're trying to do is to take ownership of that. And so normally the practitioners aren't invited to the United Nations or to major governmental bodies that are looking at education policy. And we think that the solution to all good inclusion comes from real practitioners on the ground. And so I've created this framework where we've invited all the major UN bodies, UNICEF and UNESCO, and there's a lot. And about 50 education ministers. I have no hope for the education minister from the United States coming, but the education minister from China and India and Turkey and across Europe and Africa and Asia and Central South America, they're coming. And a lot of the World Development Banks and all major organizations, there'll be about 5,000 participants. And the idea is that we put our minds together as to where the challenges are, what is working, let's capture that, best practices from all over the world, and then what can we advise or support governments as a result. Now, the slight difference is that normally practitioners meet, like for example, school principals, superintendents will all meet together, but they don't necessarily meet with like you having superintendents and school leaders with, let's say, corporate and with tech and with specialists, right, and with academics all together crunching over the same issues. That is what's unique here, and that together, our voice together will produce a white paper, and we'll launch that at the United Nations in New York. And so my commitment is that anyone who's coming to the World Congress in Kazakhstan on October 15th to 17th will be invited to the United Nations. And again, most school teachers, school principals, superintendents don't get invited to the United Nations. And so this is another way of elevating those voices. And I hope this will be a little bit of an annual cycle, but it might be every other year. We'll see what we can cope with. I think and see what happens. It's the first time we're doing it.
I love it. One of the things is if you go to your website and you get to see how the Congress is being organized and coordinated, it's multi-day, it's opportunities to sit at different tables with different people who do work as well as unlike work, and to continue to share ideas. It's almost like a World Cafe model, if you're familiar with them, about really wrestling with a overarching question and then really harvesting that wisdom to create sort of a direction. And I don't think I realized it until you've mentioned it here today, really how this Congress will be the inaugural sort of creating what is not just our moral focus, but really what is our compelling purpose that can then help lead and encourage wherever any one country happens to be in that moment. Don't stay in that space. Let's take that next step. In the United States, whereas obviously, as you somewhat indicated, I mean, the federal government seems to be sort of abdicating from its responsibilities to educate at the federal level and is going to leave it to the states to figure it out. And that's really troubling. Whereas that is not the way that most other nations are going. They're really kind of trying to think about what role might a centralized central government be able to support and advocate for children who, even in some countries, so you and I have talked offline where I do some work in Peru and I've done some work in Papua New Guinea. And in both those situations, children with exceptional needs or special needs are typically stay home. Parents don't send them to school because schools are not totally sure how to support and educate, and parents don't want to be a burden on the school. Whereas that maybe their next step is, how does the World Inclusion Congress really advocate for this is not a burden on the system? This is exactly what the system has been built for, is to educate all children and meet them where they are and then help them get to that next step. To me, I didn't realize what role in terms of advocacy the Congress was going to do.
There's maybe just two other points just to add to that one.
Yeah.
I think that the future of inclusion needs to be cross-sector and cross-national. So you have, for example, I mentioned the idea of tech, right? But actually tech doesn't do well with specialists, doing well with practitioners and academics. What happens with a school is you receive the options available rather than necessarily being weighed in knee deep in the actual discussions about the development of those options. And certainly when it comes to things like inclusion, what you tend to get is the evolution of industry and companies supporting things where there are gaps, which is great, but it isn't necessarily helpful if you can't afford it. And actually what we need to do is to bring lots of different stakeholders together. I said to the education minister of Indonesia, I said, for example, if you were to train all of the education psychologists that you need for your country, it's going to cost you $1.7 billion and it will take you 7 to 12 years. And most of those will end up leaving and working somewhere that's going to pay them properly. And I said, that is not a solution that's doable for your country. And that is true for most countries. I'm not sure if that's true of the States, but that's certainly true of the vast majority of countries. So we're going to have to come up with a different solution. There will never be enough speech and language therapists, occupational health, and so on and so forth along this trajectory. So therefore, we need to use cross-sectorial and cross-national thinking. That's the first thing.
If I could interrupt just for one moment, because I've been working with a company called Impact Speech. And they provide SLP services, so speech language pathologists, and over a virtual model, so a telehealth model. However, the two founders, one worked at Google, one worked at Apple. They developed Siri, they developed voice recognition software. And so what they're able to now do for kids is as children produce and practice, it will give them immediate feedback on whether or not what they're producing is accurate, as well as in the background, be able to create that report for the case manager about what next steps might need to be done. The kid can practice not just at home, they can practice in the classroom as a center, so they don't have to leave the classroom and almost be spotlit as they leave. Oh, that's the child who needs speech services. So we can honor and value the child's experience. I'm super excited about what they're able to do. And you've just helped me think through even more so why is it just restricted to some of the work that they're doing in the US? And they're bilingual. So why wouldn't they begin opening up this service of SLPs worldwide, or particularly in Spanish-speaking countries, this opportunity for kids to get the kind of services that they need?
That is World Congress thinking, right? That is because you have two people from different parts of the world who are thinking about sort of from a global perspective, what could the problems, and then suddenly we're finding solutions which could be used locally. And that is exactly what's missing from this picture. And the other thing, by the way, and this is a critique of England and a critique of America and a critique of Australia and Canada to a large extent, and there is a couple of other countries I could add to that list, is that we think that we know best. And so what we tend to do is look at our own feet. And actually, when you take away the money, of which, of course, there's never enough in those countries anyway, everyone's always complaining about the lack of money. But if you take away the money, then what you're left with is pushing the necessity for creativity and innovation. And so actually, the countries where you find the most innovation, pushing the boundaries of what is possible with inclusion, is not actually so much in America. And I mean, there are, of course, examples. I just put the phone down to Clemson Life, who are doing amazing work in their sort of post-high school transitions and programs, training in work for young people with disabilities. It's amazing. But actually, a lot of the innovation is in what's happening with my colleagues in Bosnia and what's happening in Zambia and what's happening and so on and so forth. So my latest book is all about this stuff. It's all about examples from all over the world where they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible, which is really amazing. And so that's another thing to learn. I hope there's a lot to learn from the rest of the world.
Totally agree. Yes, I live in a country where we sometimes think, what do we have to learn? And let me just say, we have a lot to learn. Can I ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the show, which is, how does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
I mean, I'm just the most flawed person I know. So I have an unusual journey into education myself. So I didn't complete high school. I didn't get a first, but I have various postgraduate masters and did a PhD and various other sorts of things. So I have this sort of experience, lived experience of failure. And when I lead my organization, my working assumption is I'm the most flawed person and also the most incapable person. So leading from behind, I call it, is whereas I'm literally at the bottom of the ladder and everyone else is more competent than me. And for me, this is a very lived thing. It's not a theory. I mean, I'm just reflecting on it with you now. Now, there's something which I should point out about this, which is I was the school leader for probably in America you describe as a deputy principal. And so my next obvious step was to be a school principal. And actually, I'd started writing for the national press and about inclusion stuff. And I realized I'd make an awful school principal because I'm just not trustworthy enough. I'm too ADHD. I'm not reliable. I'm too much of a rebel. I would be terrible. Now, my wife, who I have a very loving relationship with, she pointed out to me, she said, Daniel, I'm wondering in education if anyone's going to take you seriously because you're not what you describe in England as suited and booted. I don't wear a suit. I wear a t-shirt and shorts everywhere. I'm quite fat and I'm very eccentric and I'm very weird and I just don't sound like a normal leader, really. And so what I decided to do then was to really lean into it and just be completely open about my imperfections, how I'm very flawed, and what I found was that people react as if that's disarmingly real and refreshing and honest and open. And so, for example, whenever I give talks, I'm very brutally honest about my own failures and who I am. And it's a real case of take it or leave it. This is who I am. I'm not going to pretend. And whether I'm speaking to a student or I'm speaking to Lords in the House of Lords here, I'm just trying to be me. And in some ways, people feel that gives them permission to be them. And I find that really kind of works really well. It has worked really well to my favor. You'll never see me in a suit and tie. And people find that surprising, but it kind of works for me.
Our guest today was Daniel Sobel, internationally respected voice in inclusion education and the founder and chair of the International Forum of Inclusion Practitioners. We invite everybody to come October 15th through 17th in Kazakhstan to the World Inclusion Congress. You can find it online at
www.ifip.group.
Daniel, I wrote some words down as you were talking, and first was, from the very beginning, aspirational. And then you said the word rebel, which is something that I totally see you as a rebel. And then you used the word that I also wrote down for you, which is you're refreshing. And so let us both celebrate the rise of the practitioner. And truly, I just want to thank you so much for your time. This has been a real joy.
Thank you. Likewise.
All right, we're back. So enjoyed talking to him. I'm always like, I hope you enjoyed it, but I know you did.
I did. I mean, I think we say that aloud and to the listeners, and I'm hoping the listeners liked it, but in some ways it's like, probably good enough.
There were so many takeaways, and in some cases, different from others. There's like a steady theme that runs through so many different leaders that we talk to. Yeah. And in this case, some new themes emerged and really sort of spoke to me in terms of like teacher preparedness and stuff like that.
Can I carry a thread from how we opened this conversation? So you mentioned Kazakhstan and the IFIP World Inclusion Congress. Why is it important? What is it that you think would benefit folks to attend?
Yeah, or just to be aware of. Obviously attending, I think, could be pretty special. I think part of it is, it's this case when we do our own trainings within our own school districts. We don't often look out to see what others are doing to sort of help like our own practice improve. And so to take that to this next level of like the way that we understand educational systems within the United States, and then taking a step back and understanding how other countries are approaching similar issues. And so one of the things I thought was kind of interesting is that he says specifically like that the Congress aims to set our own agenda. And then we take that agenda of inclusion into our own hands. And not just wait to see what policy shifts occur, what people who have nothing to do with education, what conclusions they draw and then like push policy, but rather allowing the practitioners to sort of guide and dictate or at least inform practice. And I thought, like, for me, I went, oh, yeah, we should be doing that locally, regionally, nationally. And he's saying, and how about internationally, where we then come together and say, this is what we believe, because children are children. And in some cases, children who have disabilities, who have exceptionalities, who have needs that can't be met according to the whole spectrum of need. I'm not just talking about children who struggle, that there are, opportunities missing in certain places. And so it's like, what can we do as a global force to sort of influence how education looks and what it can be for kids? To me, I thought that was really powerful vision.
Yeah. This is one of the key approaches to our work, to both you and I, and one in which I sort of trumpet but consistently, and that is, who's doing it better than you?
That's so true. You often ask me, like, where is that happening? And so he like brings up like, there's all this innovation going on in Bosnia and in Zambia. Yeah. And I'm like, of course there is. I've had the real honor of doing some work in Peru and in Papua New Guinea. And you see in areas where they're not resource rich in the sense of like school resources. And they are approaching education in innovative ways and meeting the needs of kids. And it just blows my mind. And so that's why it's important. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that he talks about that, about places where they are not resource rich, having innovation being a key tool for trying to meet the needs in more creative ways. And that's what it ends up happening because you don't have the money. I do want to say, as a counter, this is a public education, as a teacher speaking, there has the comment of we can't just throw money at the problem as it relates to public ed. We've never tried. And so I think attempting it wouldn't be such a bad thing. Let's try throwing gobs of money at the quote unquote problem of public ed and see what happens. My guess is we've got some practitioners that will get some things right.
I agree with you. Here's what I would say in terms of money being allocated. Historically, I would say that a lot of money has been allocated. The problem is that it is restricted. So they tell you how it can be spent, and you're going, that's not what I need. What I actually need is this. But you're not actually giving me the funds and the resources to do it. You've told me I need this. You don't know what I need. Are you working here? Are you talking to the families? No.
Can I make a connection to literally one of my favorite leaders that TED Talks? In fact, if you just want to see his initial TED Talk, it's, I think, one of the best ever. And it's a man named Ernesto Cerroli, and he did a TED Talk about listening. And his entire focus, he has a thing called enterprise facilitation, which the entire approach, this is about supporting entrepreneurial people in multiple countries around the world. And his entire approach is, why don't we just listen to them? That's the entire thing. When he said, I come in, we've got zero infrastructure, my favorite, zero plan, because I don't need it. They have a plan. I just have to listen. And then all I have to do is figure out how to connect them to the resources that they're asking for. That's
great connection.
I love it. And that's our approach. That's APC. That's my organization's approach. Like, teachers know what they need. Let teachers talk to teachers about teaching, and surprise, they're able to identify where they feel like they could improve.
Yes. Okay. So in your example you just gave, I would say, so that's the difference between coaching for compliance, which is what, when we talk about gobs of money being spent, sure, it's restricted. It is coaching for compliance. It's checklists. And you're speaking to, if it were gobs of money that said, we're going to listen, respond the way that you're asking for, and make those resources available. That's peer coaching.
Yeah. I highly recommend this TED Talk only because, and my friends and colleagues will know that I talk about him. I think he's hilarious. I think he's just an amazing leader that basically says, listen. And that takes me to one other part of this interview with Daniel Sobel, and that he talks about 100 papers that he's published and his team that he's worked with 10,000 schools. And the number one thing above and beyond all others is upskilling. The phrase he uses, upskilling teachers to be able to meet the needs of all children in the classroom. If you upskill teachers, we'll solve 95% of the issues. To some degree, this is what you and I are doing. That's what the point of this podcast is, upskilling. We're trying to upskill for superintendents and other leaders. Like, listen to this group, other people, and you can get better yourself. It's not about hiring outside necessarily or finding the program that's already ready to go. The question that I had, though, related to your comment about not being, what did you call it? Not being skillinged at all? Or not getting enough?
I just said, you're talking about upskilling, and I haven't even been skilled. I wasn't even skilled. It wasn't about sort of continued learning and continued development. I hadn't even gotten the basic understanding of how to meet the many needs that were going to be in my classroom.
So if you could change one thing about education training and any preparing that we are required to do, whether it be university-based or certification processes, et cetera, but you could change one thing that you think would give more skill to educators, what would you change?
I love it. Okay. First of all, two things. The first is, no.
I said one thing and you went with two things.
The first is only to provide an appreciation that you have brought this one up, because for me, this was the biggest sort of, I'm so glad you're talking about upskilling. And the fact is, when we talk about money, that it isn't necessarily about throwing money. It's about making sure that people have the skills so they can meet the needs of kids. So I don't need more devices. I don't need all these other things. I do need the skills to be able to meet the needs of kids. Okay. So what would be the one thing? One of the things that I found so interesting around medical schools is the move to problem-based learning. They have moved away from just drilling and killing in terms of you're going to memorize all these things. Yes, you have to memorize a number of things to understand physiology and biology and all the kinds of things that go into medical school. One of the things that they have really expanded in terms of the coursework is project-based learning. Somebody enters your office or comes into the emergency room and they've got these symptoms. Now, what are you going to do? Who are you going to engage? What are the systems that you're going to connect to? What does the treatment look like initially? What does the treatment look like after the fact? How will you know you made the right diagnosis? How will you follow up? All those kinds of things we should be doing in education. And I would love to see that in the schools of education of saying, you have a child in your class who can't read, right? You're not going to be like, I'll just give them more reading or I'm going to give them easier text. What are the steps to kind of better understand where this child is getting pressure, where this child is struggling? Or this child doesn't seem to have number sense. Let's go back to what is the assessment you're going to use? How will you use that assessment? How will it inform? How will you know you're being successful? What does progress monitoring look like? All those things are given to us as at least my memory going through teacher prep is sort of like a laundry list of things that you could do, but you don't go through it as if it were like a tabletop exercise, a real scenario building. That I think would have been really helpful. And I would hope that's what is going on now. So you talk about children with intensive needs or moderate needs that as a whole group, you could be talking about as a classroom.
Yes.
This is what I would try to do for that kid. This is what I would try. Have you thought about this? Oh, I've got this experience. And then you're really learning together. That's the difference I would like to see. What would it be for you?
Yours ties to mine. The first, if I can link back to Ernesto Ceroli, if we could universally teach educators the thread of listening throughout the whole thing, learn how to listen for the benefit of someone else. That's huge. I hate even using the word because it won't be medical in this way, but it's almost like therapeutic listening. Do you know how to listen so that you can better understand how people are processing information? That's teacher all the way through superintendent. Number two, how do you do that? And how do you do that with multiple different focus areas? The medical model basically gives doctors rounds. They learn and practice in multiple different areas, both to find a focus area for themselves, as well as to better understand all of the different ways the system is playing with each other so that they can make recommendations and thus problem solve a complicated case.
Totally.
We do 0 rounds.
Yeah. So I've seen an example of rounds, and it can look like where, as opposed to reading someone's chart as you approach their bed, and then you all have a conversation about this patient.
Right.
In advance, a teacher says, I want you to look for Peter in this classroom. I'm not even going to tell you who Peter is. And I think it'll be obvious based on behavior. Or Peter sits at the triangle table and he's really struggling in reading and I cannot crack this code. And so I'd love for people's advice and just as you're doing your observation, those kinds of rounds would be so powerful. But that's peer coaching.
Yeah,
I've seen rounds where it's just the principal engages in rounds and walks around and comes through. That's not, we do want the principal to be sort of the lead teacher. Absolutely. And it's even more powerful when you do it as peer coaching, peer learning, peer support, giving your colleagues the opportunity to engage with you. They're in it every day.
I'm saying I'm all for this. Those are practical steps that are actually, I would say, though I'm going to call them small steps, they're still really hard to do. No, I'm talking about an overhaul. I'm talking about that you decide you want to be an educator. You must teach multiple grade levels in elementary, middle school, and secondary before deciding where you're going to go.
Oh, interesting. I would say that some education programs, like the sophomore year, they do go to multiple, like they have to do observations and they go to different grade levels to observe. And then their junior year, for which they do their no, they don't do their student teaching. They have to spend a certain amount of time at K2 and a certain amount of time at 3-5. Yeah. And then their senior year, the first semester, they do 2 weeks at K, 2 weeks at 1, 2 weeks at 2. They go all the way up to 5th grade. And then their spring semester they're placed at a grade level. That's awesome. I don't know if they all do that. I just am familiar with at least one. That's exactly the model that they use. And you're like, oh, I love it. Because you went in thinking, I want to be a first grade teacher. And you're like, you're actually best equipped to be a 5th grade teacher. And so go get them.
Yeah.
You build great relationships with these pre-teens. And
You have
that's
no
a special,
idea.
yeah.
I mean, you have no idea. And you also evolve. You also better understand that example. You better understand child development, K through 5, that the brains are not the same and they're focusing on different things and they're changing rapidly. You better understand vertical alignment as it relates to curriculum and where there are holes. It's amazing. The reason why I want to do it secondary to elementary is that, my gosh, that gap between the secondary experience and the elementary experience is
It's
a
massive. Yeah.
canyon.
Yeah. It would be a great use of if you did I don't know how they would do this, but I don't have to worry about the logistics at the moment. Let's just talk about dreaming. If you had high school teachers, one of their professional development days is different from elementary, because elementary is going to be in session, and they come and spend a morning or an afternoon in an elementary classroom. They could learn so much around classroom management and community and support, and to see kids at their different, and then flip it. Have elementary folks go spend some time in middle school and high school classrooms to see these masters of content and the way that they have to organize and teach their units of study. I think they would really value each other's experiences, and maybe there would be less blame about things.
And this is me and you who have similar experiences. So much overlap. And we're brainstorming, we're like, that's interesting. Well, that makes me think of this, or that makes me think of that. So if we end with Daniel and his approach, what would a World Congress brainstorm around this? What would they come up with that you or I aren't even, it's not even in our brain. That's the whole purpose. The purpose is to bring
If
in
I were
these people.
Daniel, I might be saying that's exactly why you need to come. I can't tell you what they're going to come up with because they haven't done it yet. And what's going to be marvelous over these many days, and he's planning to do something at the end of this school year in New York at the UN. So if that happens, we'll keep everyone informed. And to continue the conversation and to almost do a handoff to the delegation and representatives from Qatar, and have conversations around what they've talked about, what they've learned, and then keep that conversation going. So I don't know, but I believe there's so much to learn from each other to make this world just a little bit smaller. And in the absence of real leadership in this nation and even abroad, we as educators have always led the way in building bridges and better understanding others. And so why shouldn't it be us? Why shouldn't we be the ones leading the way? I love it.
I love it too. Let's land there.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Amansan.
And before we say that we'll see you next week, hey, listen, if you want to put a comment in there about what you think they should be talking about at the World Inclusion Congress, put it in there. Give us 5 stars and then give us a tip.
There's the thing. That's there's the rub. Please put any comment you want. Add your ideas. Sure. 5 stars would be great.
All right, Jamie, I'll see you next week.
Yeah, take care.